Every story has a beginning, an origin. For us, the first part of the Bible begins with Genesis. But really, we know that there are 5 books that begin the Christian Bible, and those are Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. We call that the Pentateuch. And that is its own beginning to all that would come after. But one of the things that we experience in our lives when we are growing up and learning about the Bible in Sunday school is we learn a lot of stories and just bits of scripture. And a lot of those are just in that very first book, Genesis. In fact, a lot of them are just the beginning of that first book. Genesis begins with the creation story, actually 2 different creation stories. And then after that, it introduces us to Cain and the story of Cain and Abel. And then there's Noah's Ark. And then after that, there's the Tower of Babel. So much happens in just the first 10 chapters of that first book. And then after we get into that, this sort of all this big worldly grand scheme story brings us to a single person named Abram and his wife Sarai. And they are greeted by God and given a promise that they will be prosperous and that God will be with them and with their children and their children's children forever. It's a really startling change of pace from what the beginning of the story is. But now we get Abraham and the patriarchs. So the story of Genesis, the origin, the beginning of all things, is an introduction first to the beginning of the world and then to the patriarchs, Abraham, and then Isaac, and then Jacob, and eventually one of his 12 sons, Joseph. And it's a story that gets us to Egypt, where the real story begins. In a sense, this first book of the Bible is the prologue that will invite us into the rest of it. Right? The real story of the Pentateuch, the real sort of centerpiece of the origin of the Hebrew people comes after Genesis. It's the 4 books that follow. And that story begins with liberation, the Exodus, which takes up about the first half of the book of Exodus. And that's, even though this is the big-er story for the Hebrew people, it is just the beginning. It's the beginning of the story. Everything that follows is what matters. It reminds me a little bit about watching a Spider-Man movie. When you go see the 3rd Spider-Man movie, you're not planning to go see Spider-Man get bitten by a radioactive spider again and have that conversation with Uncle Ben again, where he says, great power comes with great responsibility, right? You go because of what Peter learns from Uncle Ben. Because of all of that origin, great origin story of Spider-Man is that it inspires everything that follows, right? You don't go to see the origin story over and over again. You go to see what it leads to. And all of the beauty comes from what that origin leads us into. And that origin story, which was centered around a promise, is what we end up seeing through the rest of the Pentateuch. So, God liberates the people from Egypt, and then they have to figure out what it means to follow this deity, this God, who has revealed God's self as the great I am. And that's what we're doing. All the stuff that happens, all the giving of the law and the sharing of it, all of the sort of figuring out how it is, the grumbling in the desert, the getting to the promised land, being able to see the promised land across the river. That's 4 books worth of material, all summed up there. All of that is part of the promise that God made to Abraham and said, I will be with you. So as God liberates the people, God promises to be there with them anyway. And we see it in 2 forms, the fire and the cloud. Right? They can see and know that God is with them through it all. This is where we begin.